January 1885, High Rockies. The thermometer reads 40 degrees below zero. At that temperature, sap freezes inside the trees until they burst like rifle shots. If you looked down into the valley that winter, you saw panic written in smoke. Every chimney was belching gray clouds, desperate signals of men feeding stoves that were eating wood faster than they could chop it. But on one claim, halfway up the ridge, there was no smoke, no chimney, just a mound of snow that looked suspiciously like a grave. The silence up there should have meant death. Instead, it meant Jax Williams had figured something out. The men in the valley had exactly one opinion about Jax Williams. They said he was digging his own tomb. In a mining camp, digging is for gold, not for living. You build up. You stack logs. You fight the wind with timber. When Jax started moving earth instead of felling trees, the local wisdom was that the altitude had finally scrambled his thinking.
It's easy to see why they thought that. A man building a log cabin is a hero of industry. You can see his walls rising. You can hear his axe ringing off the canyon walls. It's visible struggle. But a man digging a hole looks like a man giving up. It looks like a retreat. For 3 months, while his neighbors were chinking gaps and stacking cords of pine, Jax was just disappearing deeper into the hillside. They called it the stone pit. It wasn't a compliment. To a man from the east, living underground meant one thing: dampness. It meant root cellars. It meant breathing stale air and waking up with a lungful of mold. It went against every instinct of the frontier, which was to conquer the land, not crawl inside it. They watched him pry boulders out of the creek bed, heavy, rounded river stones, and haul them up the slope. They watched him disappear below the grade, day after day, muddy and silent. They shook their heads and went back to their chopping blocks.
And that's the real story here: the chopping block. To survive a winter in a standard cabin, a man needs 4 cords of wood. That's a pile 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 32 feet long. It represents weeks of back-breaking labor. You have to fell it, limb it, bucket, split it, and stack it. Then you have to carry it inside, armload by armload, every single day. It is a slavery to the stove. You are not the master of your house. The fire is. If you stop feeding it, you die. Jax Williams looked at that pile of wood, looked at his axe, and decided he was done. He retired the tool. He hung it on a nail and left it there to rust. While the rest of the camp sharpened their blades every morning, terrified of the fire going out, Jax was investing his sweat differently. He wasn't avoiding work, he was front-loading it. He understood that the labor you do once, moving the earth, pays you back forever. The labor you do with an axe pays you back for exactly 2 hours.
But you can't explain that to a man who is freezing. Fear makes people conservative. It makes them cling to what they know, even if what they know is killing them. The log cabin is a romantic image, but thermally, it is a disaster. It is a wooden tent that leaks heat like a sieve. The village opinion was that a house needs walls you can see. They feared the weight of the earth above their heads. They feared the darkness. They didn't understand that the danger wasn't the soil. The danger was the air. The air in the valley was the enemy. At 40 below, the air is a thief. It steals heat faster than you can make it. By building up into the wind, the miners were exposing 5 sides of their homes, 4 walls and a roof, to that thief. Jax Williams exposed nothing. He tucked his home under the blanket of the sod, where the wind couldn't find him. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was insulating himself from its temper tantrums. So when the snows came deep and the passes closed, the talk in the saloon turned grim.
They hadn't seen smoke from Jax's ridge in weeks. They assumed the stone pit had done exactly what they predicted: collapsed or frozen him stiff. They didn't know that while they were waking up to frozen water buckets and frost on their blankets, Jax was sitting in his shirt sleeves. They were fighting the weather. He had simply stepped out of its way. To understand why he dug, you have to understand why the log cabin is a failure of engineering. To understand the genius of the pit, you first have to dismantle the romance of the cabin. We hold a very specific image in our heads of the frontier life. We picture the warm, golden glow of a window pane against the blue snow. We picture the cozy interior, the roaring hearth, the safety of thick timber walls. It is a beautiful image. It is also a lie. In terms of thermodynamics, the traditional log cabin is a disaster. It is a failure of engineering so profound that it requires a constant, frantic input of energy just to remain habitable. The problem begins with the material itself. Wood is a decent insulator, but it isn't a miracle worker. In the modern language of construction, we measure insulation by R value, the resistance to heat flow. Softwood timber, the pine and spruce Jax's neighbors were felling, has an R value of about 1.4 per inch. Do the math. A standard cabin log might be 8 inches thick. That gives you a total wall insulation of roughly R11. In a mild climate, say a rainy autumn in Kentucky, that is sufficient. But Jax Williams wasn't in Kentucky. He was at an elevation where the temperature differential, the battle between the inside and the outside, was extreme. If you want the inside to be 60 degrees and the outside is 40 below, you are asking a wall to hold back a 100-degree gradient. An R11 wall cannot do that. The heat doesn't just leak out, it stampedes. It migrates through the timber, seeking the cold, driven by the laws of thermodynamics, which dictate that energy always moves from high concentration to low. But the wood itself is only half the problem. The geometry is the other half. Logs are round. They do not stack flush. To seal a cabin, you have to chink it. You jam the gaps with mud, moss, clay, or rags. But wood is a living thing, even after it's dead. It shrinks as it dries. It swells when it's damp. It shifts. The chinking cracks and falls out. In a blizzard, the wind doesn't just press against the house. It hunts for these weaknesses. It turns every hairline crack in the mud into a jet nozzle, blasting freezing air directly into the living space. This creates the cruelest irony of the log cabin, the draft cycle. When it gets cold, the natural instinct is to build a bigger fire. You stoke the stove until the iron glows cherry red. But fire is a chemical reaction that requires oxygen, massive amounts of it. A roaring wood stove is essentially a powerful air pump. It sucks the oxygen out of the room to feed the flames and sends the exhaust up the chimney. Nature abhors a vacuum. As the fire pushes hot air up the flue, it creates negative pressure inside the cabin. The house must inhale. It pulls replacement air from the path of least resistance. Those cracks in the chinking, the gap under the door, the loose frame of the window. The hotter you burn your fire, the harder you suck the blizzard into the room. You are physically vacuuming the cold air inside in a desperate attempt to stay warm. This is why the pioneer accounts describe a very specific kind of misery. The sensation of your face scorching while your back freezes. The air in a cabin is never still. It is a constant, turbulent loop of convection. You are not heating the room. You are heating a river of air that flows from the walls, past your body, into the stove, and out the chimney. You are trying to heat the sky. Jax Williams looked at this system, this thermal sieve, and saw it for what it was. It was a high-maintenance engine that demanded fuel every 2 hours, day and night. If the engine stopped, the heat vanished instantly. There was no storage. There was no battery. There was only the relentless flow of calories from the woodpile to the sky. He realized that as long as he was building walls against the air, he would lose. The air was too thin, too mobile, and too cold. To win, he had to stop fighting the atmosphere and start trusting the only thing in the Rockies that wasn't frozen. He had to trust the ground. Jax didn't learn his engineering from a textbook. He didn't have a degree from a university back east. He learned the most important lesson of his life from a yellow-bellied marmot. He watched these animals when the first hard freeze hit the high country. They didn't try to build a nest in the branches of a pine tree. They didn't try to gather enough grass to insulate a shelter on the surface. They disappeared. They went down. Jax realized that the animals understood something the miners had forgotten. They understood that the surface of the earth is the most volatile, dangerous place to be in the winter. It is where the wind screams and the temperature swings 50 degrees in a single afternoon. But if you go down, even just a few feet, the chaos stops. The wind can't reach you. The temperature stops swinging. The earth is a stabilizer. To understand why, you have to look at the geology of the Rockies. In this region, there is a boundary hidden in the soil called the frost line. It's the depth to which the groundwater freezes solid. In the high peaks, that line sits about 6 to 8 feet deep. Above that line, the ground heaves and cracks. It freezes and thaws. It is active. But below that line, the Earth is indifferent to the season. It doesn't know if it's January or July.
This stability is due to a phenomenon physicists call phase lag. Soil is dense. It is heavy. Heat moves through it incredibly slowly. Think of the summer sun beating down on the mountain in July. That heat energy is absorbed by the surface, but it doesn't stay there. It begins to travel downward, inch by inch, like a slow ripple moving through a pond of molasses. It moves so slowly that the heat absorbed in midsummer travels 10 feet down and arrives exactly 6 months later. This is the Earth battery. While Jax's neighbors were freezing in January, the soil 10 feet below their boots was effectively releasing the stored warmth of last July. It works in reverse, too. The cold of winter travels down and reaches that depth in the middle of summer, providing natural cooling. It is a perfect, natural flywheel that flattens out the extremes of the climate. Because of this lag, the temperature of the Earth below the frost line settles at a stable range. In this high-altitude latitude, that number hovers between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit. 48 degrees. It doesn't sound warm. You wouldn't want to take a bath in it. But you have to look at the math the way Jax did. You have to look at the lift. Up on the surface, inside those drafty log cabins, the miners were starting their day at 40 degrees below zero. To get their room to a livable 60 degrees, they had to raise the temperature 100 degrees. That is a massive thermal lift. It requires a tremendous amount of energy to bridge that gap. They were fighting a 3-digit deficit every single morning. Jax Williams, sitting in his pit below the frost line, started his day at roughly 50 degrees. Even with no fire, no heater, and no effort, his home was naturally 90 degrees warmer than the air outside. To get to that comfortable 60 degrees, he only had to lift the temperature 10 degrees. That's it. A single candle could almost do it. His neighbors were trying to boil the ocean. Jax was just trying to warm up a cup of tea. This was the geometry of his survival. He wasn't creating heat. He was conserving a baseline that nature provided for free. The Earth offered a 52-degree subsidy to anyone smart enough to claim it. But claiming it wasn't as simple as walking into a cave. Caves are damp and dark. To make this work, Jax couldn't just find a hole. He had to engineer one. He had to create a space that sat deep enough to tap into that thermal battery, but was structured enough to keep the mountain from crushing him. Knowing the physics was free. Accessing that heat required moving the mountain itself. The tool that defined Jax Williams' life wasn't the rifle or the axe. It was the short-handled spade. When we think of the frontier, we think of sharp edges cutting through timber. We think of the saw biting into pine. But the stone pit wasn't built by cutting. It was built by subtraction. It was built by the brutal, repetitive, back-breaking act of moving the earth, one shovelful at a time. To understand the scale of what he did, you have to look at the tools. A pickaxe, a pry bar, a spade. These are instruments of torture when used for 10 hours a day. They don't glide like a well-oiled saw. They jar the bones. Every strike against the Rocky Mountain hardpan sends a shockwave up the arms and into the shoulders. Jax Williams moved approximately 3,500 cubic feet of earth. That number is abstract on paper. In reality, it is a staggering volume of mass. It is roughly the weight of a modern locomotive, moved entirely by human muscle. He didn't have a mule team for this part. A mule can't turn around in a pit that deep. He had a wheelbarrow and a ramp. He would loosen the soil with the pick, shovel it into the barrow, push it up the incline, dump it, and go back down. He did this thousands of times. The local miners watched him from the ridge, shaking their heads. They saw a man wasting the precious summer months playing in the dirt while they were securing their timber. They didn't see that he was building a fortress. It is important to distinguish what Jax was doing from the common sod house of the Great Plains. The soddy was a necessity of the treeless prairie. It was built by cutting bricks of turf and stacking them up like masonry. But a sod house is still a surface structure. It sits on top of the ground. It still has 4 walls exposed to the wind. It is essentially a log cabin made of dirt. It relies on the insulation of the walls to keep the cold out.
Jax wasn't building a sod house. He wasn't building walls to block the wind. He was using the planet itself as his wall. To do that, he had to go deep. A root cellar is typically dug to 6 feet, just deep enough to keep the potatoes from freezing. But 6 feet wasn't enough for Jax. At 6 feet, you are still influenced by the surface weather. The frost line might not reach you, but the thermal stability isn't absolute. Jax dug to 15 feet. He went down past the topsoil, past the clay, into the dense, rocky subsoil that anchors the mountain. At 15 feet, the earth is a solid, unmoving mass. It is decoupled from the blizzard above. It is a thermal vault. But digging a hole that deep presents a terrifying engineering challenge. The deeper you go, the more the earth wants to close back in. The pressure on the sides of a 15-foot pit is immense. If you just dig a hole, the walls will eventually slump and bury you. Jax had to dig at a precise angle, terracing the excavation until he could reinforce it. He wasn't just a laborer. He was a geotechnical engineer working by instinct. He borrowed techniques from the Icelandic turf builders, laying a stone footprint with the flattest rocks he could find to prevent his timber supports from rotting against the damp earth. He joined his heavy lodgepole frames not with nails, but with intricate notches and pegs that would swell and lock tighter with the ground's moisture. He understood the angle of repose. He knew exactly how steep he could cut the clay before it surrendered to gravity. This was the sweat equity that the other miners couldn't understand. In the economy of the frontier, time was currency. You spent your time hunting, trapping, or panning for gold. Digging a giant hole seemed like a bankruptcy of time. It took Jax 3 solid months of labor. From the first thaw of spring until the first flakes of October, he was in the ground. He sacrificed an entire season of prospecting. He sacrificed the easy comfort of a quick lean-to. But here's the math that Jax understood and his neighbors missed. A log cabin is cheap to build, but expensive to run. You pay for it every single day in chopped wood. The stone pit was expensive to build. It cost him a summer of agony, but it was free to run. He was paying his energy bill in advance. He was front-loading 30 years of labor into a single season. While the other men were destined to be slaves to their woodpiles until they were too old to swing an axe, Jax was purchasing his freedom. He knew that once the hole was dug, the mountain would do the work for him. The excavation was the hardest thing he would ever do, but it was the last hard thing he would ever have to do to stay warm. The hole was finished. The container was ready. Now, he just needed to install the battery. But a hole in the ground, no matter how deep, is not a home. Left bare, an earthen pit is a damp, crumbling tomb that smells of wet clay and despair. It has the temperature stability, but it lacks the capacity to manage that energy. It has the potential, but it lacks the engine. Jax Williams had dug the container, but now he needed to build the battery that would power it. For this, he turned away from the timber that covered the slopes and looked instead toward the water. The creek at the bottom of the valley was a fast-moving, glacial run that had been carving through the granite for 10,000 years. The bed of that creek was paved with a specific kind of stone. These weren't the jagged, porous field stones you find when tilling a pasture. Fieldstone is often full of air pockets, fractures, and grit. It is light. It is weak. The stones in the creek were different. The water had acted as a relentless quality control manager. Over centuries, the current had ground the soft rocks into sand and washed them away. What remained were the survivors. Rounded, dense, heavy cobbles of basalt and granite. They were smooth as skulls and heavy as lead. They were pure, compressed mass. Jax spent the autumn dragging these stones up the ridge. It was a labor that looked, to the outside observer, like madness. Why haul rock when you are surrounded by trees? Why carry 20 tons of dead weight uphill? The miners in the cabins watched him wrestling a sled loaded with river rock, straining against the harness like a mule, and they tapped their foreheads. They didn't understand that Jax wasn't building a wall for privacy. He was building a thermal capacitor. This is where the physics of the stone pit diverges sharply from the physics of the log cabin. Wood is an insulator. Its job is to stop heat from moving. It tries to trap the hot air inside the room. But air is a terrible medium for storing energy. It holds almost no heat. You open the door for 10 seconds, the hot air rushes out, and the room is instantly freezing. The stove has to start over from scratch. Stone does the opposite. Stone is not an insulator. It is a conductor and a storage vessel.
In engineering terms, we talk about specific heat capacity. This is a measure of how much energy a material can swallow before it changes temperature. The river stones Jax selected, mostly dense sandstone and sedimentary cobbles, had a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.84 kilojoules per kilogram Kelvin. This was a critical distinction. The granite common to the peaks held a lower capacity, around 0.79. Jax knew the difference. He knew the river stones were the superior battery. It means that stone is stubborn. It resists change. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to warm it up, but once it is warm, it takes a tremendous amount of time to cool it down. By lining the earthen walls of his pit with 20 tons of this dense river rock, Jax was creating a massive heat battery. He dry stacked the stones against the dirt walls, fitting them together like a puzzle without a drop of mortar. He didn't want mortar. He wanted the stones to have direct contact with the earth behind them. This created a thermal bridge. The earth, sitting at that constant 52 degrees, was effectively charging the stones. The infinite mass of the mountain was constantly pushing its 52-degree baseline into the 20 tons of rock lining the room. Think of it as a thermal flywheel. In a machine, a flywheel is a heavy wheel that takes a lot of effort to spin up, but once it's spinning, it keeps the engine running smooth. It flattens out the jerks and stalls. The Riverstone was Jax's thermal flywheel. When a blizzard raged outside and the air temperature dropped to -40, the thermal mass of the room barely noticed. The stones held their ground. They radiated their stored energy back into the room, stabilizing the air temperature. In a log cabin, the walls are thin. The cold is right there, just inches away. In Jax's pit, the wall was effectively thousands of miles thick. It was the entire crust of the earth. The river stones were simply the interface, the transmission that allowed him to access that deep planetary heat. The result was a room that felt different than a cabin. In a cabin, the heat is directional. It blasts from the stove, scorching your shins while your back freezes. It is a frantic, sharp heat. In the stone pit, the heat was omnipresent. It radiated gently from every single surface. The floor, the walls, the bench. Everything was the same steady temperature. It was the feeling of being inside a living thing rather than a wooden box. But there was a danger in this design. Jax had created a perfect, sealed thermal envelope. He had built a fortress against the cold. But a fortress with no way in or out is just a prison. A human being produces moisture. We exhale water vapor with every breath. We sweat, we cook. In a sealed pit, that moisture has nowhere to go. It condenses on the cold surfaces. It breeds mold. It turns the air heavy and poisonous. Jax had solved the problem of warmth, but he had created a new problem of suffocation. A hole in the ground isn't a home without lungs. If he wanted to survive the winter, he had to teach the pit how to breathe. The greatest danger to a man living underground isn't the roof collapsing. Gravity is predictable. You can prop it up with timber. The real killer is the air. If you seal yourself in a hole tight enough to keep the heat in, you have also sealed yourself in a coffin. A human being is a machine that turns oxygen into carbon dioxide and water vapor. In a space as small and tight as the stone pit, the air goes bad within hours. It gets heavy. It gets wet. The pioneers called it dead air. It makes you sleepy first. Then it gives you a headache that feels like a band of iron tightening around your skull. Eventually, the moisture from your breath soaks into your bedding, and the mold starts to grow. You don't freeze to death. You rot. Jax Williams knew that a hole in the ground isn't a home until it has lungs. He had solved the problem of temperature, but now he had to solve the problem of respiration. And he had to do it without opening a window, because opening a window at 40 below zero defeats the entire purpose of the pit. He needed a way to bring the outside in, but on his own terms. His solution was a piece of engineering that looked primitive but functioned with the precision of a Swiss watch. He called them his breather logs. Before the ground froze, Jax had felled 2 massive lodgepole pines. He didn't cut them into firewood.
Instead, he spent weeks hollowing them out. This is a miserable, tedious job. You use a long auger to start the hole, then you use hot coals to burn out the heartwood, carefully scraping away the char until you have a wooden pipe 20 feet long and 6 inches wide. He buried these wooden lungs into the hillside before he ever laid the stone floor. This is the detail that separates a master builder from a man digging a grave. He placed the intake log deep, buried 6 feet under the soil, running horizontally into the base of the pit. The exhaust log ran from the ceiling of the pit straight up through the sod roof, poking out into the winter air like a periscope. This arrangement created a passive engine known as the stack effect. Even without a roaring fire, the physics of air density took over. The air inside the pit, warmed by the earth and Jax's body to 55 degrees, was naturally lighter than the dense, frozen air outside. Warm air wants to rise. So, the stale, used air naturally drifted up toward the ceiling and escaped through the vertical exhaust log. But nature abhors a vacuum. As that old air left, it pulled fresh air in to replace it. This is where the genius of the buried intake log comes into play. If Jax had just put a vent in the wall, he would have been sucking 40 below zero air directly onto his feet. But because the intake log was buried under 6 feet of dirt for 20 yards, the freezing air from outside had to travel through a long, earthen tunnel before it reached the room. As the air moved through that wooden pipe, the earth warmed it. The soil transferred its heat into the airstream. By the time the fresh air spilled out of the log and into the pit, it wasn't 40 below anymore. It was 40 degrees above. Jax had built a geothermal heat exchanger out of a dead tree. He was breathing fresh air that had been preheated by the mountain itself, free of charge. This wasn't a new idea, though the miners in the valley had never seen it. Jax was tapping into a lineage of vernacular architecture that stretched back centuries. He was channeling the logic of Icelandic turf houses, where builders knew that dry turf walls could provide insulation reaching 80% the efficiency of modern materials. They understood that using living materials, earth, grass, and stone, created a space that filtered pollution rather than trapping it. Jax simply adapted the physics for the Rockies. He understood that a house is like a body. It needs to inhale and exhale constantly. But the air system did more than just provide oxygen. It managed the moisture. This brings us back to those 20 tons of river stone. In a normal cabin, when warm, moist air hits a cold window, it condenses. It drips. It rots the sill. In the stone pit, the river stones acted as a massive dehumidifier. Because the stones were always slightly cooler than the air in the room, but not freezing, the humidity from Jax's breath and cooking would settle on the rocks. The stones would sweat the moisture out of the air. The water would beat up on the smooth basalt, run down the face of the wall, and disappear into the gravel drainage trench Jax had dug around the perimeter of the floor. The stones were scrubbing the air, pulling the water out so the room stayed dry. The sensation inside the pit wasn't the clammy, swampy feel of a root cellar. It was crisp. It felt like the air after a rainstorm. Jax had achieved the impossible. He had a shelter that was warm without fire and fresh without a draft. He had warmth and he had air. But there was one final piece of the puzzle missing. The heat from the earth was steady, but it was static. It hung in the air. To truly thrive, to make the pit not just survivable but comfortable, he needed a way to move the energy around. He needed a circulation system that was more powerful than air. He needed water. Jax had the thermal mass in the stones and the fresh air from the logs, but he was still missing the heartbeat of the system. The stones were a battery, and like any battery, they could eventually drain. If a blizzard sat on the ridge for 2 weeks, blocking the sun and burying the earth, the temperature inside the pit would slowly, inevitably, bleed away. The stones would cool down. The air would grow crisp. Jax didn't just want to survive the cold. He wanted to defeat it. He needed a heat source that was infinite. He needed energy that didn't just sit there, but moved. He found it in the same place he found the stones, the water. But not the creek at the bottom of the valley. He was interested in the water before it ever saw the sky. During his excavation, Jax had struck a weeping vein of groundwater near the back wall of the pit. To a normal miner, hitting water is a disaster. It floods your shaft. It collapses your timber. It ruins the claim. But Jax wasn't digging for gold. He was digging for heat. He knew that this water, bubbling up from deep within the granite, had been traveling through the Earth's crust for years. It was the blood of the mountain, and it was carrying a constant, unshakable temperature of roughly 50 degrees. Jax didn't plug the leak. He harnessed it. He built what engineers today would call a hydronic loop, though he probably just called it a floor drain. He dug a winding, serpentine trench into the dirt floor of the pit, curving it back and forth like a snake. He lined the bottom of this trench with flat slate tiles he'd split by hand. Then, he diverted the seep into this channel. The water entered the room from the back wall, flowed through the winding trench across the entire footprint of the floor, and exited through a drain pipe at the front, downhill from the entrance. He covered the open trench with more flat slabs of slate, sealing the water underneath the floorboards of his home. He had created a primitive, gravity-fed radiant heating system. Think about the physics of what was happening under his boots. Water is a miraculous substance. It is dense, heavy, and incredibly efficient at carrying energy. It holds 4 times as much heat per pound as rock, and thousands of times more than air. As that 50-degree water flowed through the channel, it acted as a conveyor belt. It was constantly importing heat from the deep earth into the room. If the room was 55 degrees, the water just flowed through, doing nothing. But the moment the room temperature dropped, say to 45 degrees during a cold snap, the physics reversed. The heat from the water would migrate through the slate covers and radiate into the air. The water was a self-regulating heater. It didn't burn fuel. It didn't need tending. It just flowed. As long as gravity pulled the water downhill, new heat was entering the pit every second of every day. Modern architects spend thousands of dollars installing geothermal heat pumps to do exactly this. They drill wells, install electric pumps, and burn kilowatt hours to force the Earth's heat into a home. They are using active energy to harvest passive energy. Jax Williams had no electricity. He had no pumps. He had gravity. Gravity doesn't break down. Gravity doesn't send a bill. By positioning his pit below the spring line, he let the weight of the water do the work. The mountain was pumping the heat for him. This changed the entire character of the stone pit. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a machine. A log cabin is a dead thing that you have to whip into life with a fire. The stone pit was alive. It had lungs breathing air, a stone skin holding heat, and a water circulatory system moving energy. The most striking difference, however, wasn't the warmth. It was the sound. If you have ever spent a winter in a cabin with a wood stove, you know the noise of survival. The fire roars. The wood pops and hisses. The iron stove ticks as it expands and contracts. The wind howls through the chinking. It is a violent, noisy existence. Jax's home was silent. There was no fire to roar. There was no wind to howl because he was under the wind. The only sound in the stone pit was the quiet, rhythmic trickling of water running beneath the stone slabs of the floor. It was the sound of a creek in summer, playing on a loop in the dead of winter. It was a psychological weapon against the isolation. While the men in the valley were listening to the wind scream and the wolves howl, Jax was listening to the sound of a thaw that hadn't happened yet. He had built a sanctuary that defied the logic of the frontier. He had warmth without fire, air without drafts, and running water before he had a roof. The system was complete. The battery was charged. The lungs were breathing. The veins were flowing. But engineering on paper is one thing. Engineering in the face of God's wrath is another. The autumn was ending. The sky was turning that bruised, heavy purple that signals deep snow. The test was coming. The valley was about to be hit by a storm that would be remembered for a generation, and it would determine whether Jax Williams was a genius or just a well-preserved corpse. The test arrived on the 14th of January, 1885. The barometer in the mining office dropped so fast the surveyor tapped the glass, thinking the needle was stuck. It wasn't stuck. The pressure was collapsing. By noon, the sky turned a color that doesn't have a name, something between bruised iron and charcoal. Then the wind hit. It didn't gust. It arrived like a physical weight against the valley floor, screaming at 60 miles an hour and bringing the temperature down to 50 degrees below zero. In the standard log cabins scattered across the valley, The world narrowed down to a radius of 3 feet around the stove. The thermal sieve effect that Jax had predicted went into overdrive. The wind stripped the heat from the timber walls faster than the cast iron stoves could replace it.
Men were burning their furniture. They were burning their staking posts. The draft cycle was so violent that the candles flickered and went out, sucked dry by the vacuum of the fire. Water froze in the basin 10 feet from the hearth. It was a 3-day siege where sleep was forbidden. If you let the fire die for an hour, the cabin became a coffin. The livestock froze standing up in the sheds, their lungs crystallized by the air. It was a noisy, frantic, terrifying battle against a simple lack of heat. Halfway up the ridge, buried under 6 feet of fresh drift, the stone pit was silent. There was no wind howling through the chinking, because there was no chinking. There were no walls to shudder under the gale. The storm was raging 5 feet above Jax Williams' head, but to the earth, a blizzard is just surface noise. The soil dampens the vibration. The screaming wind was reduced to a dull, distant thrum, like a train passing miles away. Inside, the conditions were boringly consistent. Jax checked his thermometer. It hovered at 54 degrees. The hydronic loop was still flowing, the water carrying the steady warmth of the deep crust under the floorboards. The river stones, charged with months of geothermal contact, held the temperature like a heavy anchor. The moisture from his breath condensed on the cool rocks and drained away, leaving the air dry and breathable. He didn't have to go out to the woodpile. He didn't have to fight a frozen door latch. He didn't have to do anything. This was the psychological shock that Jax hadn't anticipated. He had prepared for the cold, but he hadn't prepared for the idleness. Survival on the frontier is usually a full-time job. It is a constant cycle of chopping, hauling, feeding, and fixing. But Jax had engineered himself out of a job. He had automated his own survival. For 3 days, while his neighbors feared for their lives, Jax Williams sat in his shirt sleeves, reading a water-damaged copy of The Count of Monte Cristo by the light of a single oil lamp. He whittled. He slept. He listened to the quiet trickling of the water under the floor. The storm was the greatest threat the territory had seen in a decade, and he was completely irrelevant to it. When the wind finally died on the 4th morning, the silence in the valley was absolute. The snow was drifted 10 feet high against the tree lines. The miners, exhausted, red-eyed, and terrified, began the slow work of digging out. They checked on each other, shouting from ridge to ridge, counting the survivors. Then they looked up at Jax's claim. There was nothing there. No chimney smoke, no roofline, just a smooth, white drift where the hill used to be. The village opinion solidified instantly. Jax was dead. The fool had buried himself, and the mountain had finished the job. A group of 4 men, carrying grain shovels and expecting the worst, hiked up the ridge on snowshoes to recover the body. They wanted to give him a decent burial before the ground froze too hard to dig. They found the location of the entrance by the depression in the snow. They dug down, tossing the powder aside, hitting the timber frame of the door after 20 minutes of labor. They were sweating in their heavy wool coats, dreading what they would find inside. They expected a frozen corpse, curled up in the dark. One of the men pried the latch open. The door didn't creak with frost. It swung inward, smoothly. And then, the smell hit them. It didn't smell like death. It didn't smell like stale, frozen air. It smelled like wet stone and pipe tobacco. Jax was sitting at his table, finishing his breakfast. He looked up at the 4 men, who were shivering in the open doorway, their eyebrows frosted with ice. He was wearing a thin cotton shirt. The air rushing out of the pit wasn't hot, but it was alive. It was the breath of the earth. Jax didn't ask about the storm. He didn't ask about the temperature. He just looked at their exhausted faces, then at the shovels in their hands, and asked if they wanted a cup of tea. The water was already hot. The men stood there, staring at the impossible warmth of the room. They looked at the dry walls. They looked at the water trickling through the floor. They looked at the man who hadn't burned a single stick of wood while they had burned everything they owned. In that moment, the village opinion broke. They realized that the madness wasn't digging a hole. The madness was trying to live on top of the ground, when the ground was the only thing keeping you alive. But admiration is a tricky thing. It turns quickly to resentment, and then to amnesia. It worked too well.
which is exactly why we stopped doing it.
You would think that after seeing a man cheat winter with nothing but a shovel, the whole valley would have grabbed their spades. You would expect a city of stone pits to spring up the next summer, but they didn't. The next year, more miners arrived, and they built more log cabins. They chose the shivering and the wood chopping over the digging. Why? Because the stone pit asks for something humans hate giving: patience. It demands a payment we aren't willing to make. The log cabin is the architectural equivalent of a credit card. You get the shelter today, cheap and fast, but you pay the interest on it forever. You pay in wood, in sweat, and in shivering nights. It is a debt that never clears. Jax Williams paid cash. He put down a massive deposit of suffering, 3 months of back-breaking excavation, so he would never have to pay again. But most people look at that upfront cost and walk away.
We are a species that prefers to pay in installments, even if it costs us our lives in the long run. There is also the problem of geography. A log cabin can be built anywhere there are trees. It is portable. It is convenient. The stone pit is a marriage to the land. You cannot move it. You cannot sell it easily. It requires a specific geology, a specific water table, and a specific slope. It forces you to listen to the land before you build, whereas a cabin lets you impose your will upon it. Today, we have doubled down on the cabin model. We build stick frame houses that are just lighter, weaker versions of the log shack. We fill them with insulation, sure, but we still rely on active energy. We rely on furnaces, heat pumps, and electricity to fight the cold. We use brute force to condition the air. We burn gas to heat air that leaks out of our windows. Jax used passive geometry. He didn't fight the cold, he outmaneuvered it. You see echoes of his logic in the earthships of New Mexico or the passive solar homes of the 70s. But these are still fringe oddities. We look at them the same way the miners looked at Jax, as eccentric experiments. We have become addicted to the convenience of the thermostat. We have forgotten that the most reliable furnace in the world is the planet itself, and the only fuel it asks for is the courage to dig. The axe rusting in the corner of Jax's pit wasn't just a tool he didn't need. It was a monument to a different way of thinking. It was a testament to a battle won by quitting the fight. It proved that sometimes the smartest way to handle a problem isn't to attack it, but to bury it. The legacy of Jax Williams isn't in a history book, it's written in the snow. If you hike that ridge today, long after the timbers of the cabins have rotted into mulch, you might see a patch of ground where the snow melts a little faster. It's not melting from the sun, it's melting from the breath of the earth rising through collapsed stone. He proved that the ground is the only battery that never runs dry. If you believe we've forgotten how to work with the land, subscribe for more stories from the archives.